Welcome back. Let's continue from our last video. In the previous video you saw Dane and Layla picking up their weapons and engaging in a sparring match. Observing from the balcony, Duke Thermion was struck by Dane's impressive strength, yet an inexplicable sense of unease lingered within him. At that very moment Duke Thermion, who had been watching, spoke up, addressing the knight behind him, mentioning another loss, and he wondered if this would humble Layla a bit. Hearing this, the knight captain wiped the sweat off his brow and sighed. Duke Thermion's gaze never left his daughter as he replied that of course he had known for a while, even before the Dante Cup, and after she had won the championship it had become even more evident. He had been going to talk to her seriously, but he thought it was better if she realized it herself, and the knight agreed with this, saying that it was a very wise decision. Then Duke Thermion looked back at Dane and softly asked how many mana cores he thought the boy had. The knight observed Dane fighting below and guessed at least 3 cores, and this made Duke Thermion furrow his brows slightly, murmuring that he thought it was at least 2, maybe up to 3, causing the knight to stroke his chin and ask curiously why he thought that. Duke Thermion turned his gaze forward and explained to look closely. Even though his spear technique was overwhelming Layla, it wasn't because of speed. What Layla lacked was combat strategy and experience on the battlefield. Although Layla was attacking at an almost lightning-fast speed, none of her strikes could face Dane, and in fact Layla herself couldn't believe it, asking if he could block all of them. Dane confidently responded that he could see all of her moves. Back with Duke Thermion, his gaze shifted to a moment of recollection from the past when Layla had grown the most after meeting Dane, and perhaps this time was no different. Meanwhile, the knight Herman, having observed Dane's abilities, praised him, finding it quite interesting that the young lady who had won the Dante Cup couldn't use her full strength, clearly because Count Sogres had trained him very rigorously. Hearing this, Duke Thermion almost laughed out loud, explaining that no, he didn't understand. Arkin was strict, but he wasn't the type to train harshly unlike him, and the knight asked, puzzled, what he meant by that. Duke Thermion's response was simple: overwhelming talent that ordinary people couldn't surpass. Dane was a genius. He probably hadn't joined because he wasn't interested in the tournament, and the knight said in disbelief that there was no way he wasn't interested in the Dante Cup, as that was the tournament everyone in the Althean Empire dreamed of. Unaware of the knight's thoughts, Duke Thermion firmly believed that no one at Layla's age could compete with Dane. With a touch of hope, he murmured to himself, hoping Layla would realize her shortcomings in this battle, and that if she gave up her complacency and focused on her swordsmanship, she could easily surpass her brothers. Back to the battle between Dane and Layla, the fight had come to an end, and once again the victory belonged to Dane. He had won so easily that he hadn't even broken a sweat, while Layla was drenched in perspiration, her face exhausted from the intense battle. Despite her reluctance, Layla had to admit her defeat, acknowledging that, as expected of Dane, she couldn't beat him, and she bitterly thought about his talent, and how she hadn't realized the gap between them was this big. Meanwhile, Dane lowered his spear and suggested ending the training session there, noting that she was tired and they should stop. Layla acknowledged that he had won, causing Dane to narrow his eyes slightly, thinking that Duke Thermion's wish had been fulfilled. He must have sensed that she realized she wasn't number one. After imparting a lesson to the sword fighter about who the true genius was, Dane turned and began walking away. However, just as he did, Layla shouted, her eyes wide, asking how exactly he trained like that. Dane coldly replied with 2 words: hard work. But this response didn't satisfy Layla, and she retorted that everyone worked hard. Dane paused for a brief moment and muttered that then she should just work harder, stating that he would be going now. His words left Layla momentarily stunned, and she then shouted back, determined that next time he wouldn't win. Dane answered calmly that he would wait for that as he continued walking ahead. Layla, watching his retreating figure, began to recall memories from their childhood. Dane was the only person she admired, and he was also the one she wanted to surpass. As long as she was taught and kept waiting, she wanted to witness herself grow beyond being just a girl, but she wondered why he kept surpassing her more and more. With this thought, Layla unconsciously clenched her fist and muttered under her breath words only she could hear, just to wait next time she would win. Time quickly passed, and the day of the exam arrived. Talented individuals from across the Althean Empire gathered to attend the entrance exam, including their families and attendants. Thousands of people flooded the capital. Around 6,000 candidates were set to join the Royal Academy this year. Simply paying the exam fee didn't guarantee entry, and 2/3 of the candidates failed the first round. Now, after the preliminary exam had ended, over 2,000 were preparing for the specialized second exam. Transitioning to a certain office within the Royal Academy, the professors were gathered for a meeting. A voice unexpectedly rang out, stating that 2,000 people had passed the first exam, which was a little more than usual, making it quite a spectacle. At this, a professor dressed in purple spoke up, asking everyone how many they thought would pass this round. In response, a blonde-haired female professor shared her guess, saying maybe no more than 200. From another corner, a question was raised about the candidates in this exam and if there were any promising talents. Professor Denevo, the head of the magic department, asked if the scores from the first test had come out yet. To this question, Ingrid from the Dean of Spearmanship Department responded that marking was underway and asked a question saying she wondered who will get the highest score. One of them speculated that the top swordsmanship student must be the daughter of Duke Thermion. Another confirmed, mentioning that she was the one who had won the Dante Cup and that the finals were spectacular, adding that Duke Thermion had raised her well. Professor Delfiniso, the head of the summoning department, said with eager anticipation that it looked like the top swordsmanship student would be someone to watch. Professor Esterand, the head of the swordsmanship department, confirmed her statement confidently, saying it was practically a sure thing with no competition. Another professor nodded in agreement, which caused the others in the meeting to feel envious of Professor Esterand, murmuring that the swordsmanship department had truly gained a talent and wondering when they would get a genius like that. However, while the others were chatting happily, Professor Denevo appeared deep in thought. He then took out a letter and placed it on the table, speaking slowly that he had a different perspective. Curious, Professor Ingrid asked what it was. Denevo revealed it was a recommendation letter from Sidrain sealed with the power of the Newson Magic Tower. Professor Ingrid was shocked, asking if this meant Sidrain had really recommended someone. Despite the surprise, the head of the swordsmanship department, still uncertain, confirmed that no one could surpass the winner of the Dante Cup, though his sweaty expression showed that he wasn't entirely confident in his own statement. As the others began to murmur amongst themselves, Professor Denevo continued, explaining that Sidrain, the famous recluse who didn't take any apprentices, had sent a recommendation for a 14-year-old. Professor Delfiniso asked eagerly who this person was. Professor Denevo answered quickly that his name was Dane Sogres. The mention of Dane Sogres left everyone stunned. Another member of the Sogres family, a family that had already produced two geniuses in the fields of magic and summoning, and now even their youngest son was being personally recommended by Sidrain. Back in the professors' meeting, the news of such an outstanding student from the Sogres family intrigued them greatly. After all, the Sogres family was no ordinary one, and with both of the continent's top families enrolling at the same time, it was bound to be a major topic of discussion. As they continued, Professor Esterand, the head of the swordsmanship department, suddenly had a thought and stroked his chin with interest, wondering if that wasn't the family known for their expertise in education. But if the recommendation letter came from a magician, it seemed the Sogres family might become more famous for their magic now. Professor Ingrid, the head of the Department of Spearmanship, couldn't help but feel a bit regretful, stating that she had been certain he would join the Spearmanship department. In response, Professor Denevo chuckled, saying that if he joined his department, he and Arabella would be quite the powerful duo, smiling smugly to himself and thinking that after all, the Royal Academy thrived on magic. At that moment, a flustered assistant hurried into the room with the exam results, apologizing for interrupting but announcing that they had completed the first round of exams and had the results there. Hearing this, everyone eagerly awaited the data, urging them to take a look at the numbers. On the screen in front of them appeared the results: 1,367 students for swordsmanship, 227 for magic, and 152 for summoning. The overwhelming number of students in the swordsmanship department left the professors in awe, muttering about the 1,367 for swordsmanship and only 227 for magic, making it clear that swordsmanship stood out. Professor Esterand, upon reviewing the results, happily commented that as expected, the top scorer was from the Thermion family. Professor Denevo, on the other hand, narrowed his eyes as he scanned the list, wondering where Dane Sogres was, as he didn't see his name. His remark caused the others to exchange puzzled glances, wondering if he wasn't the one recommended by Sidrain. Meanwhile, Professor Ingrid checked her own list and shook her head, saying he wasn't there either and that there was nothing they could do. In a moment of panic, a man in the meeting turned to the assistant who had entered earlier and asked if there was anyone missing from the list. The assistant, a bit flustered, checked the list again and hesitated before speaking, mentioning that there was one student who had applied for the open field specialization among the 2,000 candidates, and Dane Sogres had scored the highest in the first round. Ezen shouted, wide-eyed, asking what he had said and exclaiming that Dane Sogres had come first. Moving back to Dane, he was still deep in thought, reflecting on the time that had passed, noting that it had already been a month and time really flew, feeling like just yesterday he was sparring with Lila. Now the first round of exams was over and he was waiting for the results. Thankfully, the exam hadn't been too hard, he mused, feeling relieved. At that moment, Layla, the swordsmanship prodigy, rushed over to Dane, asking if he had gotten his results yet and what place he had gotten. Hearing this, Dane confidently extended his arm in front of her to show off, proudly declaring that he had come first. Layla groaned exasperatedly, saying that of course it was him and that she had missed out on first place. She then turned to Dane, asking how exactly he had managed to study like this. Dane replied casually that it was mostly the questions his sister had sent him. Meanwhile, the pink-haired girl, feeling a bit frustrated, commented that she had seen those too, but they were still tough, especially the military studies, wondering how a 14-year-old was supposed to know anything about strategy and military management. Dane replied, surprised that he had thought that was the easiest part, and asked if she hadn't found it interesting. His reaction was largely because of his advantage from having learned this in his previous life. As for Layla, she gave him a bewildered look, as if he were from another planet, asking if he was even human, mentioning not just military studies but also fine arts, music, and even the history of the Drake Empire in shock. Dane smirked arrogantly, saying that was his specialty with a grin. As he spoke, he recalled his past life where he had unconsciously gained a lot of knowledge while living through the battles and wars. Changing the subject, Layla asked where he was taking his second round exam. Dane replied that there were 3 places in total. Upon hearing this, Layla immediately guessed the specialization. Dane was aiming for her, eyes widening in surprise. She asked in astonishment if he was really applying for the open field specialization, wondering what else besides the education and summoning departments. However, Dane just smiled to himself, still enjoying the moment without revealing too much, teasing that he would tell her later. Layla continued to shout, still unable to understand why Dane had chosen the specialized field. She couldn't wrap her head around it, and asking why he would choose that specialization. Dane simply replied that it was because he wanted to study that field. That's a wrap. The story continues in my next video. Like and subscribe to stay notified.